This is a real attack, this is not edited in any way, this is not fake, this is an actual damage output that you will encounter in Little Cup, a tier with level 5 Pokemon. Your super effective critical hit only does 5% damage, but also it has a chance of doing 50%. It doesn't make any sense at all, but here's why it happens. There are two main things that you have to understand about the damage calculator. One is that most calculations always round down. Even if something is, for example, 3.9, it will round down to 3 no matter what. That is just how it works. And number two is that the damage calculation process is a step-by-step process, and at every single step, rounding down happens. So let's start from the beginning. Step 1. Step 1 is called base damage, and base damage is your damage that you would do if you didn't account for any modifier like stab, super effective, not very effective, abilities, items. If you ignore everything and you only look at the raw attack stat, the raw defense stat, and then the power of the move. So we'll take the example of Aqua Corphish versus Onix. Onix has a very high defense stat and Eviolite as an item. Corphish has a very average attack stat and a pretty weak move like Aqua. We input it into the base damage calculator, and the formula does look tough, but it's just addition and multiplication, so that turns into very simple substitution, and you get a number out of all that. And that number is your damage after step 1 before any modifiers have been applied. Here the damage is 3, that is 3 HP of damage. Now you move on to step 2. Step 2 is spread damage, and spread damage is a doubles concept, so if you're interested in VGC you probably need it, otherwise you can ignore it. But the real step 2 is actually weather. And for whatever reason, weather is calculated much before everything in the step-by-step process. So you have your 3 damage, and a water type move in the sun has a 50% damage reduction. So half of 3 is 1.5, which gets rounded down to 1. Now you move on to the next step, which is critical hit. Critical hit multiplies your damage by 1.5. So 1 times 1.5 is equal to 1.5, and now you round that down to 1. So effectively, your critical hit did literally nothing. Your critical hit was completely negated because 1 times 1.5 still ends up as 1. Now we move on to the random factor. As you probably know, every attack does not do the same amount of damage, and that's because of the random factor that the game implements. So how does it do it? It does it by creating 16 possible outcomes. The first outcome is 0.85 times your actual damage. The second outcome is 0.86 times your actual damage. Third is 0.87, and so on and so forth until you have one outcome that does 1 times your actual damage. Out of these 16 possibilities, one outcome is randomly chosen. So let's look at all the possible outcomes in this case. Your damage outputs become 0.85, 0.86, all the way to 1. And again we apply that concept of rounding down. So every possible outcome below 1 rounds down to 0. You are going to literally do 0 damage. And at this point you might be wondering, hey, I thought in Pokemon you couldn't do 0 damage. And that's true. But that 0 damage check happens at the very end of the entire process. If at the very end, after everything is done, if you're still doing 0 damage, then you get bumped up to 1. But we aren't at the end yet. So as it stands, 15 out of 16 times, you're going to be doing 0 damage. Now the next step is where you apply all your other modifiers, your super effective, your stab, your life orb, your ability, whatever it is. But the problem is now you're applying it to the number 0. 4 times super effective times 0 is still 0. 2 times 0 for adaptability stab is still 0. 1.3 times 0 for life orb is still 0. 15 out of 16 possible outcomes are not affected by the boosts at all. Only one of them is even getting the benefit of the boost. And now your range is actually 0 to 10, and now your process is finished, and the calculator bumps up any 0 damage output to 1, and that's how you end up with the craziest damage output of all time.